So let's construct the cape first. First, sew together the center back pieces using a 70 needle and a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then attach the side of the front cape to the back at the armhole. The back armhole piece will be bigger than the front. That's normal, just make sure those notches are matched up. And sew again with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Repeat on the remaining front cape piece. Now sew a 5/8 of an inch basting stitch across the top of the cape on both the back pieces and the front pieces. Fold the fabric over along that basting stitch and sew. This will add a little extra strength to the cape seam as we need to add straps. Cut 2 pieces of clear elastic 6.5 inches long and another that is 20 inches long. Hand sew the 6.5 inch piece 5/8 of an inch away from the armhole so that the front and the back of the cape are connected, kind of like spaghetti straps. Attach the 20 inch piece at the inside center front, then pass to the center back, then back around to the front again, behind the neck strap. Using a small hook and eye, hand sew the hook and eye to the center back of the collar, so it should be at the very top of the yoke. To close the arm sleeve, simply pin along the sleeve with right sides together, and make sure to use delicate pins. Then sew close with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Try to get as close to that armhole as you can. When you get to the wrist, stop about 3 inches above the wrist, turn the fabric under twice to create the cuff, and then sew the rest of the sleeve. Sewing the rest of the lining is pretty intimidating and it definitely requires a lot of thinking. So if you don't want to do all the thinking, you can just hand sew the lining in place using a whip stitch while turning the raw edges under and towards each other, kind of sandwiching them together. However, if you don't want any stitches to show, then you have to flip the lining over so that the wrong side is exposed, then sew the center back lining piece to the center back bodice piece where the zipper is, so that those right sides will be together. Start the stitch 5/8 of an inch down from the raw edge. Sew as close to the zipper as you can without nicking it, and then stop 5/8 of an inch from the edge. Now you're going to sew around the entire bodice while snipping unnecessary layers of fabric. Pin the lining to the rest of the bodice with right sides together and sew using a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. This can be really tricky, especially around the armholes, and if you're getting confused, just skip it and hand sew it in place. Now flip to the right side of the fabric and do a narrow edge stitch along the top bodice edge. This will be a straight stitch, and it gives that sharp neckline and makes everything lay nice and flat. Now for the lining at the waist. It helps to pin the lining to the actual bodice. Match up the bottom of the bodice to the bottom of the lining with wrong sides together, which means we're no longer sewing anything inside out. These stitches will show, but it's okay. Now flip about 1/4 of an inch of the lining over the raw edge of the bodice so it encases the raw edge, then tack in place. Zigzag stitch those 2 seam allowances together. To hem your collar, simply turn the raw edge under twice within the seam allowance. Pin and hand stitch with embroidery thread. If your fabric isn't turning under easily, cut into the seam allowance at 3 points so that the curve can fold nicely. You'll usually have to cut into the seam allowance around the shoulders and definitely at the very center. Now to finish the raw edges of your organza fabric. With the sleeves, you can simply fold the seam allowances together, turn each piece of the raw fabric inward and kind of sandwich the two together. Then sew in place on the machine. For the armhole, grab a 5/8 of an inch wide strip of stabilizer, trim the seam allowance of the armhole down to 1/4 of an inch, fold the stabilizer around the seam allowance to encase the raw edge, and stitch in place. Finish the raw edge of the shoulder seam just as you did with the sleeve. To make the sleeve points, fold white tulle in half and cut 2 3x3-inch squares. Each square should have 2 layers of tulle. Sew 2 lines from the top center edge to the opposite corners, forming a triangle. Cut as close to that stitch as possible. Attach to the side of the sleeve that is exactly opposite of the seam. And hand sew a small strip of elastic to the point so it can attach to the middle finger. The best way to hem the skirt is on a dress form, but if you don't have one, it can be done on a table or while the child is wearing it. You want to measure from the armhole seam down along the skirt side seam until you reach the desired length. So I need to measure 31 inches. And pin that length. Then you can figure out how many inches is left at the bottom of the skirt. So for me, I have 8 inches left of extra fabric. So then I can just measure 8 inches up from the end of the skirt. If you do it on the table, you have to make sure the skirt and the tulle layers are all flat so you don't have any ripples. You can pinch along the pins and flip under if you want to have a turned up hem. And you want to taper down towards the center back if you plan to have a train. Since we are sewing stretch fabric, we don't have to turn under the hem. So let me show you how to do it on the body form. I like to use my quilt ruler to measure up 8 inches from the bottom. I can easily move the ruler around to check the pins for placement. Because Elena is going to be wearing some heels, I'm going to cut about 2.5 inches below her barefoot measurement of 31 inches. I just eyeball it and gradually taper at the side seam so I can have a train in the back. After I put in the slit, I can fine-tune the hem. So to do the slit, you have to pin the tulle and the underlying skirt in place so that nothing shifts around. So it's a lot of pinning wherever you're going to put the slit. Then cut up the desired slit length. Sew a 5/8 of an inch basting stitch to keep the tulle layer in place. And fold the fabric under along that basting stitch. As you come to the top point, you'll have to taper the seam into the point. So that the narrow center point we'll only have like a millimeter of fabric turned under. Sew a narrow edge stitch using a straight stitch. And trim the excess fabric. Now you can fine-tune the hem by folding the skirt in half at the side seam. Try to smooth out as many of those wrinkles as you can and even out the hemline. You can use a rotary cutter to get an even cleaner cut. And that's it. Finally, we are finished. Well, sort of. We still have to finish sewing down all these beaded snowflakes. Those weird white circles are actually beaded patches that we have to hand sew in place and trim down. You can kind of see on the right bottom of the cape where we have one finished what it's supposed to look like. So, only 9 more to go.